You can tell a lot about what a politician thinks by asking him what's the problems that need to be solved and who will solve it.
We're back on Breakpoint this week. John, I wanted to talk to you also about a couple of cases that have come out, one of them from the Supreme Court and one of them from the U.S. Sixth Circuit. Some conservative rulings, I guess you could call them, that came down this week and have a lot of people talking. So one of them was the Supreme Court, which overturned restrictions in California. So the state of California was trying to say that people cannot gather in homes. I think it was people from more than three households could not gather in their own homes to have Bible studies or prayer meetings. Religious gatherings were off limits, even though people were gathering in movie theaters and bars and restaurants. So the Supreme Court overturned that restriction this week, saying that because similarly situated activities, like I mentioned, restaurants, bars, were being permitted, you couldn't single out activities purely because they were religious. So apparently that took all the way up to the Supreme Court to make that decision. But thankfully, the court decided this week that you can't restrict those religious activities. The interesting thing for me about that was I was just thinking about the logistics of it and the arguments you would make if you were the state trying to restrict this. Typically, people getting together for a small group are like the same people every week. You go to a bar or a restaurant and it's a whole bunch of different people filtering in and out. So this sort of gave the flavor of being a little bit divorced from the scientific attempt to stop the spread of COVID and really did feel targeted. And apparently the Supreme Court felt the same way.
Oh, man. Well, look, the Supreme Court, I think, has enjoyed over the last several weeks smacking down California's over hyper reaction against religious people. And, you know, the one thing that the court has been consistent on, even before Justice Coney Barrett, Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Gorsuch joining the court, is that the court has never been okay with governmental authorities treating religious people differently than non-religious authorities. You know, it was so interesting. The New York Times podcast, The Daily, reported on the story today and had a whole thing. It was a really interesting podcast. To me, it's a really informative podcast, even though I disagree with almost all the takes. But even in the description, with this latest victory, well, here, let me back up. The decision gave religious Americans another win against government rules that they say infringe on their freedom to worship. Look, the original government rule is that the government couldn't infringe on the freedom to worship at all. So this is a brand new one. And then it goes on with this latest victory. The question has become whether the Supreme Court's majority is protecting the rights of the faithful or giving them favorable treatment. That description reveals two things about the worldview of the New York Times. Number one is that they don't see that the original documents, the original framing of our nation has elevated and prioritized the freedom of assembly and the freedom of religion under the First Amendment rights, and that this is fundamental to the way we're going to order our lives together as a nation. You know, all of that's up for grabs, you know, in light of, you know, the unquestioned power, expensive power of the state to make whatever decisions that they want, as long as they call it in the name of public safety. You know, you see that kind of, you know, underneath that headline. The other thing revealed is this idea that law is constantly made up. It's a theory of what's called positive law. In other words, whatever the latest judicial interpretation or whatever the latest legislation is. In other words, there's not an ability to evaluate law on any sort of ultimate standard, whether it's universal human rights or right and wrong or anything like that. It's just based on, you know, whichever direction or leaning the court goes. And it's really a legislation by power. It's very much a postmodern understanding of law being a matter of interpretation, which is a matter of power. And you can actually see this in some legal speeches given by Sonia Sotomayor when she was a professor at Harvard Law before she became a Supreme Court justice. And you see that. In other words, this is a zero-sum game. It's either the government or it's you know, individuals. But it's either the government or it's religion. It can't be both at the same time. But still, even though there's, you know, the court has shown a long history, several years now, again, pre-Coney Barrett, pre-Kavanaugh, pre-Gorsuch, of basically not not allowing the government to treat religious organizations, religious individuals, religious entities different than anything else. And California has clearly been guilty of that, as has New York, and the court has ruled, pretty specifically on both counts. But now we're also dealing with a more conservative court. In other words, those who are actually more favorable to religion in and of themselves. And I think we're seeing that in a widely remade judiciary under President Trump. And now this is really the first season where we're going to kind of see all of this play out. And another progressive podcast, this one, another one from the New York Times called The Argument, bemoan the fact that this could be the end of Roe v. Wade. And maybe it is. I don't think it's going to happen this term, but I do think we're going to see what difference the elections make, at least when it comes to the judiciary. Yeah. And by all indications so far, it's made an incredible amount of difference.
So I don't know how you listen to The Daily. They do really great reporting, and I've listened to several episodes. I cannot handle Michael Barbaro. I want to do my Michael Barbaro impression of you right now. So you're saying that you're saying that The Daily was suggesting that this was a giant win for religious Americans and that now they're getting preferential treatment because they can meet in their homes and have Bible studies. I'm Michael Barbaro. Did California unfairly give new rights to religious California? I just can't handle the inflection. Like, I'd rather read the script of it later. I don't know what it is. But yeah, that's an interesting interpretation there, that this is a huge win. But sorry, I'm just
and it's all that unusual. It's really not. I mean, there's nothing here. And I guess my fundamental point is exactly that. There's nothing here that's out of step with the way the court has been going pre-Kavanaugh, pre-Gorsuch, pre-Coney Barrett. The court has always said that the government has to treat religious entities as the same as non-religious entities. This has just been part of it. You can go to the Trinity Lutheran playground case. That if secular schools can have access, to tire, rubber for their playgrounds, then so can religious schools, and the government can't choose and prioritize non-religion over religion. And that's clearly been the case. I mean, what Governor Newsom has done in California, and what Governor Cuomo has done in New York has been completely hostile to religion. In the case of New York, not Christian entities, but mostly Orthodox Jewish entities, which is, why that, but there's a disdain for it. And you can see in what they have done very much a belief that religion actually gets in the way of progress. It's the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the history of the United States has not only tolerated religious belief, it has treated it as a net good, as a fundamental good thing, that before anyone is loyal to the government, they're loyal to their conscience and loyal to God. And that actually takes priority. And a group of people that first and foremost are loyal to something above the government is going to be better citizens than if they weren't. And that is throughout the founding. That is throughout so many different that is obvious throughout the founding. That is obvious throughout the history of the United States. And again, it's obvious in the way the Supreme Court has ruled over and over and over again. There's nothing remarkable about this case at all.
Yeah. I was listening to a conversation on NPR this afternoon, and I only heard a few minutes of it, but they were talking about the difference in the way religious and particularly Protestant Americans view the role of government, as opposed to people who tend to be more progressively liberal. And the host of the show said something like, this poll came out recently and it was shocking because people don't even really agree on the role of government. And we asked, this poll, I guess, was among Protestant Americans, and they asked, what do you think is, the first and foremost role of government? And she was shocked and appalled that more than 50% did not say making good public policy. More than 50% said it was something like maintaining the safety of, she made it sound like it was people voting to maintain the status quo, which I know has like racial undertones and all, all this weird stuff we're supposed to imbue that phrase with now. But I heard it as, should the government keep us safe, or should the government be constantly making new policy every 15 minutes that costs money and regulate something that wasn't previously regulated? So to me, I'm like, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with the majority of the people that voted on that poll, that I don't view the government's role as to be constantly making policy. And I think that rolls into this discussion about the court, where the court is saying, stop making crazy policy, like allow people to live. And, if you need policy, apply it equally and then allow people to live. I don't need every inch of my life or society to be regulated. And I suppose some people actually view that as the role of government, that every day when a new, social whim enters our cultural imaginary, as I think Charles Taylor would put it, we need the government to tell us which way to go and which direction to go. So we need a new law every time something changes. And so I guess if a government that is constantly making policy is what you're looking for, I don't think most people want that. And I don't think the court, and I don't think the court is going to support that. I think that's what we saw in this ruling too.
Well, the court will in some areas, but the court won't allow that discrimination. But you're exactly right in terms of this is a deeper disagreement on what is the role and scope of government, and this is why I think Chuck Colson was so enamored with the framework that a guy like Abraham Kuyper proposed, which is often called sphere sovereignty, which is an understanding that God has ordained the universe with different spheres of human life being under different authorities, and a problem. And a problem occurs when the God-given authority within that sphere fails to exercise authority, because or they actually exercise authority over another sphere. So let's just take the spheres of home, church, and state. It's a problem when the state claims to be the authority of the home. It's also, by the way, a problem when the home claims to be the authority of the church. And that's actually something we have in corners of evangelicalism as well. And it's a problem when the church takes the role of the mom and dad, right, which sociologists have been talking about for a long time as well. A well-functioning society is when these God-given authorities function well. Kuyper, by the way, believed in that so much that when he became prime minister of the Netherlands, and if you don't know Abraham Kuyper, he was this kind of Renaissance man who was a theologian and a writer and a newspaper guy and a politician, and he did all kinds of things. But when he became prime minister of the Netherlands, he resigned his ordination as a pastor in the church, in the Church of the Netherlands, because he believed that because he was now in this sphere, he needed to step out of this sphere. So he actually tried to, in a sense, live that out. But that is a very helpful framework. And on a practical level, when you try to apply it, it looks like this. You can tell a lot about what a politician thinks by asking him, what's the problems that need to be solved and who will solve it? This was one of the revolutionary things. I don't say revolutionary and never was thought of before, but when George W. Bush, took Marvin Olasky's idea of compassionate conservatism, it was basically the government needs to get out of the way and create space for faith-based organizations. Now, we can assist those faith-based organizations. We can create space for those faith-based organizations and so on. And we need to get out of the way so that they can do their jobs. Both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, not on equal levels, but they both actually put the government into far too many areas of human life where they don't belong. Yeah. And it's a mistake. And it's also unrealistic. I mean, the government is not good at things, right? Yeah. The government is good at wide sweeping policies, not good at specific things that have to do with the human heart or the human motivation. The government can't deal with that. It's asking too much of an institution designed for something completely different.
Yeah. And that will be a tragedy here if states increasingly are trying, or attempting to be hostile to religiously minded people, is that they'll one of the unintended or maybe intended consequences of that is that they'll see less service to the poor and less adoptions and less foster care and all these areas that the church excels in. And, church doesn't excel in every area or in every state or community, but in some of these really important areas to our social fabric, the church is excelling. And states that are increasingly hostile to that, they're going to suffer in those areas, because even if the government does try to step into those areas, they will not do it as well, if history has shown us anything. So we do now want to talk about our recommendations. I have so many recommendations. Well, hold on. I have to tell you something. This week, I finished Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. Now I was reading Infinite Jest, FYI, just in case you didn't know. So this is me not recommending Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. Again, I want to reiterate, I am not recommending it. I do want to say, though, I immediately emailed our colleague Warren Cole-Smith over at Ministry Watch, who used to work with us here at the Colson Center, because I know he is a David Foster Wallace groupie. And I was like, Warren, I finished it. I have so many thoughts and feelings. And Warren sent me a piece that he did at Christianity Today a few years ago, I think on the 10th anniversary of Wallace's death. And I read through it, and then I went down the rabbit hole and looked up a bunch of interviews with Wallace and all this stuff. And I, at the risk of claiming him for our camp, I think David Foster Wallace was really, really close to becoming a religious person. And I know he went through classes to be a Catholic a couple of times, didn't end up following through. I read somewhere else that he used to give out the screw tape letters to people all the time because he considered it one of his top favorite books. So again, I just want to say I'm not recommending Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, but there's so many beautiful themes in there, and just philosophy about life, and if there's more to life, and what life is for, and what being a person is for, and all about, and that kind of thing. So do not go to your library and check out Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. My recommendation this week, and my real one, is, like I said, I was at the Gospel Coalition Women's Conference last weekend, and I had heard some of these songs before, but we actually sang one in one of the worship sets. So I have to recommend Resurrection Letters, Volume 1, by Andrew Peterson. So he has several volumes, but he's a Christian artist. Actually, our colleague Shane Morris had him on recently on his Upstream podcast, not even to talk about music. I think they were talking about stories and writing, because he also has written a series of fiction books for young adults called the Wingfeather Saga, which I haven't read yet, but I've heard is amazing. So apparently he is an Abraham Kuyper wannabe and has his hands in all sorts of different artistic spheres and can do everything well. But this album, Resurrection Letters, is just, again, if this was the goal of the women's conference, it succeeded. I can't listen to this album without crying. It's just beautiful and really theologically rich and musically rich. And especially the song, Is He Worthy? It almost felt like reading through the Old Testament, or singing a creed of some sort. It's really incredible. So I realize I'm a couple years late to that album, but if you haven't listened to it, or even if it's been a while, I recommend picking that back up.
There you go. Well, thanks for the non-recommendation before the recommendation. You're learning. You're learning quickly, Grasshopper.
John,
about
it was an 1,100-page book. I'm so deeply proud of myself. And I was telling you all today earlier on our editorial meeting. So last year, the big book I read that I then bragged about for months was The Brothers Karamazov. And late in Infinite Jest, there's a big nod to the Brothers K, and he brings it up. And I just felt like the smartest person that I've ever met, because I understood the reference. And here's one literary book referencing another one. And so if you have any questions about philosophy or life, just bring them to me, John. I feel really
well. I appreciate that. I have a recommendation for you now, as you're looking for another big one. Is that the novels of Michael O'Brien? You need to pick up A Father's Tale next. Okay. He's often called, in fact, by Peter Kreeft, of all people, a new Dostoevsky for our generation. And all of his books are also 1,100 pages, so you can talk about that. And I read two of his during. Did I mention I read two of his during COVID? Father's Tale, and then Islands of the World. Either one of those are really remarkable. He's got a remarkable way of telling stories and developing characters. So, but that's not a recommendation for everybody. Actually, that's not fair. I've given that recommendation widely on this program before.
No, I wanted to pretend it was just for me, that you thought I was especially intelligent and ready.
Well,
for
pretend away. Pretend away. Okay. Help yourself. All right. Now, let's see. The recommendation that I have is, and let me open it here in the form of a question. If you knew you could join a remarkable move of the Holy Spirit on a global scale, would you do it? Like if you knew up front you were joining a remarkable move. There's not many, I think, chances as Christians in this world knowing up front, like if I do that, I'm joining in something obviously that God is doing in human history.
I
But
mean,
you
I
can
would.
do that by the 30 days of prayer for the Muslim world. Ramadan started this week. Ramadan, of course, is a considered by Muslims to be a holy time of year. Many Muslims are using that time to seek to hear from the Lord. And there's been something that has been happening for 3 decades now, almost 3 decades now, in which Christians around the world, but about 100,000 of them, in rough terms, for about 3 decades, have prayed for Muslims to come to Christ during the season of Ramadan. And, it's structured, it's guided by a guide called the 30 Days of Prayer for the Muslim World. People have probably heard me talk about it. But the backstory is fascinating. So, we've heard, and many people have heard about Muslims coming to Christ through dreams and through unusual means, these closed countries. And so years ago, a friend of mine who is a wonderful scholar and research scientist was commissioned by a foundation who had heard these stories and wanted to go, look, are these real? What do we need to know about them? All that. So they sent this guy around the world, traveled hundreds of thousands of miles into the various corners of what's called the House of Islam. Think about Middle East, think about, immigrants to Europe and America, think about, the Indonesia, that Southeast Asia. And what he found was stunning. So looking through the history of Islam, the 600 and some odd year history of Islam, miraculous mass movements of Muslims coming to Christ, very, very rare, very rare. Only has happened less than 100 times. And he put he put a criteria, I guess you could say, around this movement. X number of baptized Muslims in the name of Jesus over so many years or whatever. And but what's fascinating is for about 30 years Christians have been praying with this guided prayer. And of all the movements, which are, again, not very many, in the history of Islam, of Muslims coming to Christ, 80% of those have taken place in the last 30 years.
Oh, my word.
I mean, we're talking about a church in Indonesia which started as a mosque in which over 1 million people became Christians out of Islam. We're talking about, mosques that just turned into churches. I mean, basically just transformed. And you go there and they're like, yeah, Muhammad's a pedophile, but Jesus is the Son of God. These are just remarkable things. And the other thing that I love about this is that this whole movement in the United States has been led by a guy that I've gotten to know. He's a remarkable guy who himself had a miraculous conversion years ago as he was a druggie on the hashish trail in Afghanistan. It's a crazy, crazy story.
Oh, my word. Wow.
Got connected with YWAM and just, he's just a fascinating guy, just a lovely, lovely guy, he and his wife. And I did a break point on it this week, and I just wanted to recommend this work that he's been doing now for 3 decades. For 3 decades, he has helped Christians and Christian families. He's even got a guide for kids, but walk through prayer for Muslims to come to Christ during Ramadan. And for 3 decades, God has answered the prayers of his people and drawn Muslims to himself in various ways at a rate that we've not seen in world history. That's the storyline. So, hey, if you had a chance to join that, would you? There you go. You got a chance. Go to 30daysprayer.org, 30 Days Prayer, or you can come to Breakpoint, click on the link for this program, and we'll link you to 30 Days of Prayer for the Muslim World.
That is so neat. John, one of my best friends in high school was Muslim, and he and I skipped school together to go see The Passion of the Christ. Okay, so I just have a really cute story to share really quickly. So we went to see The Passion of the Christ. We came back to school, and we were talking about it. We were telling all of our friends, and I had been telling him at one point, I was explaining the gospel to him. I don't think he had really been exposed to the story before. I was explaining the story to him. And we got back to school, and somehow we were talking to other friends about it, and that movie is really gory and gruesome. And I was talking to somebody else and trying to impress them and saying, did you know that, when the way you die when you're crucified is that you suffocate? It's not, it's like that you can't breathe, and yeah, just gruesome. Anyway, I said, look, I was telling our friend about it too. He came with me to the movie. And so I get his attention and I say, hey, tell him how you die, what it means when you die by crucifixion. And he goes, wait, I know this. And he sits there a second and he goes, for everyone's sins. And I was like, oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. So I still think about him a lot, and I'm going to add him to my prayer list, especially in joining these 30 days of prayer. That's really cool. Well, John, that's all the time we have. I'm going to do my best, Michael Barbaro, to take us out today. So I'm Maria Bear, and I am no, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that. Thank you for joining us on Breakpoint this week. I'm Maria Bear alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. We hope you have enjoyed your time with us today, and we hope to see you next week.